all the way through the records, the period that he was able to discuss.
Good evening, Earth.
45
This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Ranch in Taos, New Mexico. Starting a new oil painting.
Administration was extreme.
Not sure what it's called yet. We've got some blue and we've got some pink mixed up out of vermilion and white. And the blue consists of a touch of ultramarine, touch of Prussian, and more white. So it's a pretty bright light pastel kind of blue and a very stark reddish pink. Here we go.
Pinter says in his Nobel lecture, the crimes of the United States have been systematic, constant, vicious, remorseless, but very few people have actually talked about them. You have to hand it to America. It has exercised a quite clinical manipulation of power worldwide while masquerading as a force for universal good. It's a brilliant, even witty, highly successful act of hypnosis.
On the side, I should say that I have to present a small accolade to the New York Times. They actually published a letter of mine responding to Traub's quite ridiculous criticism of Pinter, but that aside. Pinter's comment is correct, but it can also be generalized, just like Lippmann's. If you look at the record of imperial cultures, they tend to be very similar. I won't even talk about the Japanese, but take, say, Britain, civilized Britain. Well, you take a look at the British intellectuals during the periods
There's a
of
great service. I found it doing a little house cleaning here, fixing stuff up,
In
and
fact, one of the most
primed
extreme
it.
examples
Looks like it
is
might have been an old
Britain.
desktop
It's
or
so
a
extreme and so
shelf
striking. And that's John
cabinet or
Stuart Mill.
something.
But
Anyway, it's got a nice frame in the back of it,
the highest
and it's
integrity and
very
intelligence.
solid. So
And wrote the
on the
classic
surface.
essay on non-intervention or intervention, which
we'll
was
see what happens.
we find it in all the law school collections and so on. He was writing it immediately after Britain's worst atrocities in India, the Indian Mutiny, as they call it, the nationalist uprising, 1857. You know, horrible atrocities, well publicized. You know, they were all over the British press. The debates in Parliament, he certainly knew about them. He was corresponding secretary of the East India Company. He was following what happened closely. Right after that, he wrote an article about intervention, which it's just like things coming out today. I mean, it was, shall Britain, which is a unique country, it's an angelic power, it's different from every other country in the world, that's uniquely dedicated to the benefit and the welfare of human species, it's selfless, and so on and so forth. Should we, this angelic power, intervene in the affairs of others to try to bring them peace and to benefit them and so on, or should we just keep to our own affairs? So should we be, in modern terms, isolationist or internationalist? And he decides reluctantly, complicated argument, that we should be internationalists. We must intervene to help the barbarians, India. We have to intervene in India. We have to take over more of India, all for their own benefit, all completely selfless. We know that when we're doing this, we're going to bring upon us the obloquy of others, especially continental Europeans, who can't appreciate our magnificence and will attribute all sorts of base motives to us. But nevertheless, we must, even though we'd be much better off if we just attended to our own affairs, we must sacrifice in the interests of mankind and conquer more of India and incidentally create the largest narco-trafficking enterprise in history and so on and so forth. That's John Stuart Mill. You can't go beyond that in integrity and intelligence. And it's characteristic. There were some critics, you have to concede. Like one of the critics was Richard Cobden, one of the very few people in England who actually believed in a free market. Everybody talked about it, but he believed in it. And he was a right-wing conservative, kind of like Byrd here. That's a little bit of an analogy. And he was bitterly critical of Robert Centerburg, who condemned the were very right-wing, but condemned it very strongly. Cobden, who was a free market liberal, one of the rare serious ones, condemned the British atrocities in India. honestly and forthrightly, but that was rare. John Stuart Mill was representing the mainstream, what we would call liberal intellectual opinion. And same in France, same in Germany. In fact, as far as I know, the same almost anywhere we look. You take a look at we now know a fair amount about what was going on in internal Russian planning, because after the Russian Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians raced to sell everything they could to enrich themselves. One of the things they sold was the archives. So a lot of archival material reached the West, and by now there's a huge scholarly industry working through the Russian archives, and most of it seeking to find something to justify U.S. actions, and there's a lot of books about this and so on. But there are some interesting things there. Among them are discussions in the late 40s among the most malevolent thugs high up in the Russian hierarchy, who are discussing with one another, not for the outside, and very seriously, what we must do to save democracy in Eastern Europe from the fascist hordes organized by the United States who are trying to undermine it. The United States is trying to intervene in Eastern Europe, much the way Iran is accused of intervening in Iraq. And we have to prevent them, their fascist forces, from doing that, because we want to preserve democracy, their highest value. They're talking to each other. It's not for propaganda for the public, which strongly suggests, again, that they have internalized it. No matter how outlandish it may be, the best and the brightest can internalize it. In fact, that's what a good education is about. It gives you the capacity and the intellectual tools to internalize the most absurd doctrines, as long as they are supportive of power interests. Point that Orwell made, incidentally.
Let's talk about a topic that I sense you're somewhat uneasy talking about, and that is the so-called Israeli lobby in the United States. And there's been, just in the last year, much more attention paid to it, or at least publicity about it. The Rachel Corrie play that was originally scheduled to be performed in New York was canceled, and then was finally put on some months later. The performance in Toronto was canceled outright. There's the Mearsheimer-Walt report, and now there's the Jimmy Carter book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. I mean, for a long time, you've said it's a factor in influencing or informing U.S. foreign policy, but in no way decisive. Do you still feel that way?
Well, part of the reason why I'm reluctant to talk about all this is that it all vastly underestimates the scale and influence of the Israeli lobby. It's sharply cutting it down. So take, say, the Rachel Corrie play. That wasn't AIPAC intervention. I mean, that's the U.S. intellectual cultural community. In New York and much of the country. I mean, New York has a center, Los Angeles is another, but it's fundamentally the intellectual culture. It's not AIPAC. No, it's not the ADL. Maybe they tried to, but they weren't the ones who succeeded in doing it. If you take the Mearsheimer-Walt paper, they define the lobby as those sectors that are seeking to control opinion and attitudes so that they support Israeli policies, including aggression, atrocities, and so on. Okay, let's take that definition of the lobby. The main component of it is the U.S. intellectual community and the media. I mean, AIPAC doesn't write the New York Times editorials. This is the intellectual climate in the United States. And you can date it pretty well, since 1967. It was not true pre-67. In fact, pre-1967, the intellectual community was skeptical about Israel or uninterested in it.
It's often pointed to Eisenhower's decision in 1956 to reverse the British-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt.
That's one example, but I was told, I suppose it's correct, that if you look at Norman Podhoritz's book, Making It, kind of self-advertisement that came out, I think, in 1966 or so, there's barely a mention of Israel. Commentary, now a rabid, ultra-extremist Israeli propaganda journal in the mid-1950s was considered so critical of Israel that the American Jewish Committee, that is, considered so critical of Israel that the Zionist organization created an independent journal called Midstream to present the Israeli point of view. Take a look at Dissent. I mean, again, they don't like the description, but it's kind of an extremist Zionist journal. So its current issue talks about Israel's misadventure in Lebanon. Kind of, that's called criticism. But if you look back pre-67, there was nothing. They regarded Zionism as uninteresting, maybe a nationalist diversion and so on.
So it's your view that with the 67 conquest, U.S. elites saw Israel as a military power that it could use in the Middle East?
The 67, from the point of view of the government, U.S. government, the 1967 war and Israel's huge military success essentially confirmed the earlier thoughts which you see in the intelligence record of the National Security Council and so on, that something like this, a logical corollary of opposition to radical Arab nationalism, independent Arab nationalism. The logical corollary would be support for Israel as the only reliable base for U.S. power in the region. That was 1958, when Israel was the only country to have participated in the British-American interventions in the region, in Lebanon, Jordan, and so on, to try to prevent the spread of the threat of Iraqi nationalism at the time, after the overthrow of the British-backed government. Is 58, and Israel was the only country that helped out, allowed overflights and so on, and it led to such proposals which had been there before. I mean, back in 1948, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had indicated that Israel was potentially the most powerful military force in the region after Turkey, and could be, you might think of it as a base for U.S. power. In 1958, incidentally, the Turkish-Israeli alliance was formed secretly, but it was formed, and it's for Israel the second most important alliance after the United States. This is all part of the framework for controlling the region. 67 nailed it down. I mean, the main importance was that Nasser was destroyed. Nasser was the symbol of, center of secular Arab nationalism, and they were afraid of it. For one thing, he was fighting a proxy war with Saudi Arabia. Remember, throughout the history, the U.S. has tended to support the most extreme fundamentalist Islamic groups and to oppose secular nationalism. That's pretty steady. And it was very clear then, they were fighting a proxy war in the Yemen, and it was a threat to the Saudi monarchy, which is the oldest and most valued U.S. ally in the region, because that's where the oil is. Well, Israel smashed Nasser, got rid of the threat of secular nationalism, with its there was a lingering concern that they might want to use the wealth of the region for the benefit of its own population, and not for Western wealth and power, with a little bit raked off for the gangsters who run the countries. That's a major threat. Israel finished that, and that firmed up the U.S.-Israeli alliance. And it led to a very quick change. You can see it dramatically in the attitude of...
the aid skyrocketed.
The aid skyrocketed, but also the attitudes of educated elites towards Israel changed radically. And it continued. Like in 1970, Israel intervened to prevent a potential Syrian move to protect Palestinians who were being massacred by the Jordanian army in Black September. And U.S. aid to Israel again skyrocketed. But what's talking about the intellectual world, the attitudes change sharply. I mean, that's when you start getting, concerned about the Holocaust. Before that, when people could have actually done something for Holocaust victims, say in the late 40s, you didn't have anything. But after 67, it skyrocketed. Holocaust museums all over the country, biggest issue, you have to study it everywhere, ignore it, and so on, not many could do something about it. A lot of that, I think, had to do with domestic U.S. issues, not with Israel.
For example?
Well, you have to remember what was going on in 1967. First of all, the U.S. was fighting a war in Vietnam. It had not been able to crush Vietnamese resistance. Now, later, intellectual elites will tell you that they were always against the war. You look back at the time, and it's not true. In fact, I went through a lot of this literature, the Kennedy memoirists and others, and they just changed their stories. And so Arthur Schlesinger, for example, who wrote an almost hour-by-hour account of the Kennedy administration, 63 or 4, whatever it was, this says almost nothing about Vietnam, they barely discussed. In his later version, when he reconstructed it, it was a major issue, and Kennedy was trying to get out, and they were discussing it. There's not a phrase about it in the earlier one. And the same throughout. The attitudes changed. Everyone suddenly became a long-time opponent of the war. Well, they weren't. It's very much like Iraq today. The so-called opponents of the war, overwhelmingly, are opponents of U.S. failure, not opponents of the war. So if, as Schlesinger put it at the time, he was criticizing Joseph Alsop, the right-wing supporter of the war. He said, if we all pray that Joseph Alsop will be correct, and that the United States will win in Vietnam, and if it does, we'll all be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government. But he's not correct, so therefore we have to oppose the war. That's the kind of opposition there was. Later, changed when the war became unpopular and so on and so forth. But here we're at a time, 1967, when the intellectual world was pretty much the way Schlesinger described, hoping for victory, deeply concerned that we weren't succeeding in beating up those little yellow bastards. And here Israel came along and showed how to treat third world people properly. You'd kick them in the face. If you go back to that period he made, people were making jokes about why don't we get Moshe Dayan and send them over to Vietnam, we can do it right. Well, they won a lot of points for that. Furthermore, there were things happening inside the United States. This was what is now called the time of troubles, meaning the time when American society became much more civilized. There was the women's movement was beginning, the student movement, students weren't just taking orders. Martin Luther King was beginning to organize the people's movement. The people who are supposed to be passive and acquiescent and obedient were standing up for their rights. That's terrifying. Okay, again, symbolically, Israel showed how to deal with it. You smash them in the face. And again, lots of points. This is the time right before the, in New York, shortly after this came the Ocean Hill, Brownsville conflict, so the teachers, the struggle between the teachers' unions and the black communities. Well, the teachers' unions were substantially Jewish. This was the poor immigrant community of a generation earlier who had worked themselves up, just like the Irish and others had worked themselves up into the bureaucracy and the better positions. And now the people down at the bottom were trying to do what they had done 30 years ago and get, run their own schools, fight for their own rights. And you had a sharp conflict there. I remember relatives who communists all their lives in the teachers' union suddenly become ultra-right-wingers because of this. Okay, again, symbolically, Israel was showing how to deal with it. And I think all of this had a big effect. However you interpret it, you can certainly see the effect. It's dramatic. And since then, you have overwhelming distortion of the picture of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not because of AIPAC. I'm sure they like it, but they're a small part of it. Now, the Mearsheimer Wall narrowed the focus. They defined the lobby properly, but then they narrowed the focus to some Jewish organizations. They do point out that the numerically biggest group.
All right, it's an interesting start, I think. I like the color combination inspired very much from a
anything is real buzz because that's
Edwin Church painting.
But
There's a little fragment in a waterfall that's got this great light that's pink and blue, translucencies catching sunlight. And I just thought I'd really emphasize that combination and in a similar sort of soft way as the detail in that painting, and then go from there building it up. So that's where this one's coming from, and where it's headed, I'm not sure. But I like the start. So anyway, that's Adam Sturch podcasting for the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting as of yet untitled. Have a good night, Earth.
But if you look at the influence on converts, which is real, no doubt, a lot of it is kind of symbolism. Like it's very